This first game that we're showing tonight, it's actually the 7th game in all against Mike Bredoff. Well, he was born October 22nd, 1940. He passed away March 31st, 1982. Didn't live very long at all, Bredoff. He was from Redwood City, California, at least when this was played. What his place of birth or origin might have been, I'm not certain. But he started the game with e4, to which Bobby replied c5. He almost exclusively, if not exclusively, played the Sicilian defense against e4, and specifically Najdorf's variation. Knight f3, d6, d4, and we get an open Sicilian after these pawns are traded. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Knight f6, knight c3, and a6 is, in fact, Miguel Najdorf's variation. Bishop e2 is Opachensky's variation. And now e5 hits the knight. You can play knight b3. Bredoff played knight back to f3. Bishop e7 here. Bishop g5. Queen's knight d7. And a very unusual knight h4. Most common is pawn a4. Let me show you that line first. That line is answered with pawn h6, hitting the bishop and sending it back to e3. Now, knight g4 is most common and is often played for prearranged draws by repetition, because what tends to happen is the bishop goes back and then the knight comes back and the bishop comes back, etc. And then you just repeat the position and get out of there with an early and quick prearranged draw. But anyway, knight h4 here. Now h6 hits the bishop, and the bishop returns to e3. Bobby plays knight to b6. I think knight c5 is the preferable way to go. And the knight comes back to f3, kind of a wasted move. The better choice is queen to d3. And that maintains an equal position. Instead, knight back to f3 was played. Bishop e6, castles. Knight c4 puts the question to this bishop. That question is answered by this bishop. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop, hits the rook, and rook to e1. Now Bobby castled. That also gets an inaccuracy, but it seems sensible to me. Knight d2 hits the bishop. I actually preferred a4 right here. I think that's a perfectly good move. Knight d2 was played, and bishop back to e6. Now pawn f4, and that is marked with a question mark. Queen f3 seems preferable to me. Maybe not, I don't know. Okay, that gets an inaccuracy. But since the annotator's not working, I'm not seeing any arrows as to what the bot finds to be the best choice. Maybe get this last rook on this half-open file. Perhaps. No symbol, so at least it's not a mistake. Well, f4 is what was played, and pawn takes the pawn. Bishop takes the pawn. Queen b6 check, forking the king and the b-man. Bishop e3 is really the way to go, I think, but king h1 was played. It gets a question mark. Bishop e3 will still be answered by queen takes pawn, but then bishop d4 can be played, defending the knight. In this game, king h1 was played, and queen takes the pawn, and now the knight needs to move to safety. Knight d5. He played bishop takes knight, which I think is better than knight takes. If knight takes and pawn takes and bishop takes, you get rook takes. Well, black is still the better here. Let's come back to the game now. Bishop takes d5 is played, and that's a better move, because now after pawn takes bishop and knight takes pawn, our bishop is protected. Now you may wonder, can he not attack? Well, I'm also attacking his bishop here. Knight c4 here hits our queen, and simultaneously discovers an attack against the knight. So queen b5 moves the queen to safety and defends the knight. Knight takes the pawn on d6, and now queen to c6 super attacks this knight. The knight retreated to f5, and now the desire is queen takes the knight, and the point is that removes the defender of our bishop. So even after queen takes queen, knight takes bishop, forks the king and the queen. It's a Forkosaurus Rex. So bishop to f6 alleviates that problem. Bishop e5, wanting to trade bishops. Bobby played queen's rook to d8, lining up with the queen. That's marked as a mistake. What about rook f to e8? Rook f to e8 super attacks that bishop. And after bishop takes bishop, we would rook takes rook check. And then after queen takes rook, we would queen takes bishop, hitting this knight. And he would have to probably play queen f1 or knight g3. But queen's rook to d8 is what was played. Queen g4 getting out of the rook's line of fire, and bishop takes bishop. Black is definitely up to no good, even though this gets a question mark. He probably should put a rook on e8, maybe even the rook that he just moved, now that its job is done. Slide it on over to e8, and then after bishop takes bishop, queen takes the bishop, defending against the checkmate. Let's come back. So bishop takes the bishop, rook takes e5, and now the checkmate threat is here, so he has to play queen f6 anyway. And queen's rook to e1, doubling those rooks on the open file. And of course, he can sacrifice his rook on d5 for the same reason as before. If rook takes the knight and rook takes the rook, then knight to e7 check forks the king and the rook. And that knight will be defended by the rook on e1. So, for that reason, knight to c7 was played. Now, you should probably try knight e7 check anyway, but he went with queen e4 and got an inaccuracy. Knight to e6 obstructs this file and negates this massive battery. So, Bredoff went pawn hunting and played queen takes b7. He would have been well advised to create some luft for his king by playing h3. But queen takes b7 is a massive blunder, and the eval bar shot up in black's favor, as you can see. Well, this is a very common tactic. I have won with this tactic within the last year over the board tournament play. There is a back rank weakness right here. And for that reason, the rook on e1 is now overworked. It cannot leave its defense of the first rank, for if he does, rook d1 will be a back rank checkmate. And for that reason, black can and does play queen takes rook on e5. Double exclam! And of course, white resigned. There's nothing left to do.